Not okay. Everyone, we're back. We're talking time with caffeine. This is the continuation of the Dapper Dinosaur Marathon. He's spent 2 hours talking about spirit science.
Oh, goodness. Don't remind me.
Two words that do not go together in that case.
Yeah, my goodness. That was dumb. Now, to be fair, he got a few things that were kind of right, or like I could tell where he was going, and it wasn't completely wrong. But then, yeah, he's like,
write it twice a day.
Yeah, it's just Deepak Chopra nonsense. It's like, oh, hey, did you know that quantum mechanics is that literally anything can happen at any time, and also your consciousness creates reality? It's like, no, it doesn't say either of those things.
No.
But now we're switching from spirit science to spirit politics, kind of.
Yay!
Yeah, kinda. Yeah.
So
good segue.
From what I've seen in history, for the longest time they have kind of been intertwined. Like ancient Egypt, for example, like the pharaoh was like the head, like one of the head religious people too.
Yeah. So I mean, we want to start out with like, the earliest history that we have. Politics and religion were often basically the same thing. So one of the things is every government has to have a reason why they're the ones who get to do things that other people don't get to. Because you got to remember that the state is essentially the social institution that basically gets to do all the things that if anyone else did would be seen as horrible atrocities, right? So for instance, if RJ here did something I didn't like, and my response was to lock him in my basement, even if he'd done something wrong, most people would see me as being right. Most people would see me as being some kind of monster. But when the state locks RJ up in their basement for having done something, well, okay. And similarly, if I decided that I didn't like the way that, say, my neighbor was treating his neighbors, and I went and I blew up his house, we would see me as a monster, even if he was mistreating his neighbors. But when, say, the military does it, we go, yay! So basically, the state is that organization in society which maintains a regional monopoly on the initiation of force, and that is allowed to essentially basically get a pass on being immoral. Now, whether or not that's a good thing, I think most people conclude that ultimately it's necessary to have some kind of organization like that in order to compel pro-social behaviors and dissuade antisocial behaviors to at least a minimum amount. So I don't want to get into the justifications for or against state having autonomy, but you have, in order to have that position, right, there has to be a story that you tell people as to why you're authorized to do things that no one else is. And for most of history, that authorization has come from religion. And it's like, okay, well, why is it the pharaoh gets to execute people, whereas if I do it, I'm a murderer? Even if those people are in the wrong. And the answer is, well, the pharaoh is a living god. And if you go to, say, Mesopotamia, the answer is like, oh, well, this person is a descendant of the gods and he's chosen by them. Or if you go to China, it's like, oh, well, this person has the mandate of heaven. And so the celestial bureaucracy has determined that this is the person who is correct to guide all of the Han Chinese into their glorious having a countryness. I don't know, sorry. Didn't really have a noun there that worked. But that has changed recently, so now we usually tell stories about consent of the governed, and democratic processes and whatnot. But that's a very modern thing. And so divine right has been the most common excuse for why the government has to do what it does, basically up until the modern period.
The Romans.
Mm-hmm.
Because the Romans had a republic that there was functionally a state religion involved, but they weren't terribly fussy about it. Where it eventually got farther down the road is that there became an imperial cult where they didn't really care who you worshiped so long as you made sure that you dotted the T's on worshiping the emperor. And that got them into trouble with monotheistic religions like Judaism and Christianity until Christianity became the official imperial religion, in which case everybody has to go along with that. But there are always kind of limits to what a state orthodoxy can do, as Akhenaten found when he created the Aten cult in Egypt and bucked the old Luxor gods. That basically didn't last past him.
RJ, there was a gap between when Christianity became the official imperial religion and when when other religions were then outlawed. There was a period during which Christianity was the official.
It was about
religion.
a generation. It didn't take long.
No, it didn't take long. But I also don't want to pretend that it was the same event.
Oh, no. And even as there was, it was regional. There were the whole rise and fall of these things. Of course, we're way early in the game to deal with the kind of church and state issue. The whole issue comes about whether or not the state has an official religion and can it enforce that orthodoxy. And we still have examples of that today where the Queen of England is the head of the Church of England. People don't normally think of it that way, but yeah, the Anglican Church is the official religion. And in Germany, which we tend to think of as a very secular state, and it largely is, but they still tax everybody to pay subsidies to churches to maintain their properties and all of that, which would not pass muster over here.
No.
Yeah, back to the Roman thing. I think it's less of a thing now, at least in some places. But back then, it's like, even though you might at least privately do this, and publicly you're like, the emperor's Christian now. Well, so am I.
Well, that was certainly a thing that happened. So religion and politics gets complicated. So in the early, through the Bronze Age, basically into the Iron Age, religion and politics were essentially the same thing. There was a state religion, and if you wanted to be a full citizen of any given polity, you probably had to at least act like you cared about the state religion. By the time we get to the Romans, though, it gets a little bit more complicated. So like RJ was saying, we have this imperial cult. And the Romans were big on saying, oh, hey, we just conquered this group of people, and they have these gods. Oh, well, they're probably just the same gods that we're worshiping, but with different names, right? So you guys have
a statue in the Pantheon. Everybody's fine. Just make sure you worship the emperor, okay?
Yeah. It's like I think the Romans, if I remember correctly, they either merged their gods with the conquered gods, or they just add the conquered gods into their pantheon.
Typically. Now,
there wasn't really much amalgamation going on. Everybody maintained it was very polyglot, and by necessity. Because the Romans sprawled across a gigantic piece of real estate where there were lots of different religions. The idea of maintaining an orthodoxy required rather more ideological things, and Christianity had spread rather quickly in that regard. We see the same thing with Islam, where a single group comes in, independent of the cultures there. Everybody has to follow the line, or we'll kill you.
Well, I think it was more the Roman and the Greek gods were more amalgamated with each other.
There was a lot. Well, the Romans copied an awful lot. The cultures, there had been a lot of fertilization going along before you even got to the stage when the Romans started being a nuisance on the scene. So there's cross-fertilization going on with all those religions, and that's kind of very far afield from the subject about what happens in the modern Enlightenment times about whether or not there should be state religions, and particularly in our case, the United States, where we were founded on a very secular framework, and all the people constructing the Constitution were very mindful of all the religion wars and that had been going on in Europe, and they wanted to keep that out. So they deliberately didn't want to have a decision made on the state, even though there were technically established churches in some of the states at the time of the Constitution. And gradually, even those states began to wean themselves off of that process. Where things started to hit the fan is in the 19th century over prayer in the schools, and it had to do with the fact that immigrants were coming in, and they were largely Roman Catholics, and suddenly you had a really serious thing where the Protestant paradigm, that was the majority of the population initially, had rivals. And if you have a democratic institution where the people who are ruling decide the thing, what happens when they want to have their prayer? The Catholic do a Bible in the schools for the prayer rather than the Protestants. And at that point, things got dicey. You had riots in Philadelphia over this where people actually died. And you find an awful lot of anti-Catholicism spreading around where Protestants join the secular idea of keeping prayer out of the schools, not because they were secularists, but because they didn't want the wrong prayer in the schools. And that then kicked into high gear as we moved into the 20th century when Catholics increasingly became more politically powerful, and that just accelerated the process.
let's just go back. Let's go back a little bit, and I think that's been along for a while. Like where I don't know if it's happened in Ness's area, but I think originally the 30-year war was started over government and religion.
Oh yeah, that was between Protestants and Catholics. It tore Germany apart in the 17th century, killed millions of people. It was everything that you could think of how religions can go wrong was going wrong during the 30 Years' War. And it was one of the reasons why the whole German area was such a discombobulated mess of little princely states in the time until the Prussians took over and consolidated everything as the big German Empire in the 19th century. It was absolutely devastating.
So Ness, anything about that in your area?
Well, I don't experience a lot of religion in my area, but I have seen some things happening. Like there are some schools that teach creationism, although not a lot, but I still have heard some of it. Yeah.
Yeah. Ironically, creationism is way less of a hot button issue on this point, at least certainly in the United States, than either abortion or prayer. Those are the ones that get everybody exercised. The ACLJ from Jay Sekulow, who became President Trump's lawyer, that network is obsessive about those issues and now transgender issues in a way that evolution is kind of like a little sidebar, which popped up every once in a while in the 80s and in the early 21st century with the intelligent design movement, but has actually been remarkably peripheral. It's prayer, the endorsement of, air quotes, traditional values, which is reflected by hyper-conservative, largely Protestant evangelicals, but not entirely. You have a lot of conservative Roman Catholics in the same area. And that's the primary dividing line that we can see across the board in issues of whether or not the state should be mandating particular policies or avoiding mandating particular policies. Educating on sex education, that's another hot button issue. So sex, prayer, abortion, that are the major issues that divide it and constantly remind us about the tenuous boundary layers that occur, the fact that, and it's so much it matters as to court rulings. And it's one of the reasons why conservatives were so adamant to get as many people as they could on not only the Supreme Court, which was done during the Trump administration, they now have a working majority, as well as all the circuit courts, to have as much influence as they could on the legal institutions to define by law what they can't get through legislative means.
Yeah, I was hoping we could have V-Blade on here. She knows a lot about the English, about the subject, but talking about that, earlier that we're talking about the government arresting you for doing something, but like for the longest time, the English people could arrest you or chop your head off if you were a Protestant, later if you were a Catholic. Sorry, you're the wrong religion. Either convert, leave, or die.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's why the Puritans came to America. Not that they believed in religious freedom for anybody else. They only wanted religion freedom for them, and they didn't bow down to the state religion in England. And they weren't big enough of a minority like the Catholics that constantly were bouncing back and forth. We have to remember, during that whole period in the 15th and 16th century, it was a ping pong match over whether or not the king was a Catholic or not, and or the queen. And so you would lurch back and forth between Henry VIII, who established an independent church, but functionally it's Roman Catholicism with the king at the top. And then suddenly he is dead. His son doesn't last very long, who would be a Protestant, and his Catholic daughter, Queen Mary, comes in and tries to lurch the country back to Catholicism. She dies. Queen Elizabeth comes along, lurches the country back to Protestantism. Then she dies childless, so they bring in the Scottish kings, who were pretty much closet Catholics themselves, and they try to keep it downplayed. But Charles I was much more openly Catholic. He had his head chopped off. There were Puritans that came in. lurched the country to Puritanism. That was such a pain that they brought the son back as Charles II, who said, basically, let's just stay calm. He converted to Catholicism on his deathbed. His brother, James II, was now an open Roman Catholic. He was voted out, and there was a revolution on that. They brought in a bunch of Protestant Germans to then pick up the slack. And now only it was in the early 18th century that things kind of settled down. Now they had more important things on their plate than internecine squabbles. They had to deal with the fact that the Louis XIV was such a powerhouse with Catholic France. And then in the next century, they had to deal with the French Revolution and a whole different set of parameters as to where religion and piety fit into the game. So they kind of downplayed that Catholicism angle, and you see in the reforms in the 19th century in Britain, where now you could actually vote if you were a Catholic eventually. That was a revolutionary thing. Yeah. In the United States, there was also that same level of prejudice where no Catholics allowed, and within the lifetime of me and my mother, going back all the way into the 1920s and 30s, if you travel that far back, the idea of a Roman Catholic being president of the United States was horrifying to Protestants. When Al Smith ran in 1928 and got swamped by Herbert Hoover, that turned out well. You didn't get a first Roman Catholic president until 1960 with Kennedy, where there was still a lot of fuss about it, but not nearly as conniption fit panic as you had back in 1928. And now practically nobody pays the slightest attention. Oh, yikes, telephone call. Hold a moment.
So Dapper, what's your thought on all this?
Well, I mean, of course, everything RJ is saying is, as far as I know, accurate. But my last thought was actually going to be to describe one of the little nuances with the Roman take on religion, which was that they had trouble when they encountered the Jews, and so they actually ended up giving the Jews a special dispensation to exempt from the imperial cult as long as they continue to behave themselves. But one of the reasons that this didn't extend to the Christians is because a lot of Christians ended up not identifying themselves as Jewish, because during the early centuries, Christianity was distinguishing itself from Judaism and becoming a strongly proselytizing religion, which Judaism never was. And so that is why you get this strange tension where the Romans weren't, as a rule, saying everyone has to, pay at least lip service to the imperial cult. It was everyone but the Jews, and if the Christians are going to call themselves not Jews, well then, you have to do your civic duty. And if you don't, it makes us suspicious that you're disloyal.
Yeah. The Romans treated some of these religious groups that had political ambitions. Remember, the whole idea of Christianity is that Christ would be king. So this is like a political statement, and they had to go, well, we mean it like metaphorically. We're not actually talking about overthrowing the emperor. And so that issue came into play. And also the fact that local areas would have trouble because people would be traditional, just as if somebody today sets up a Baphomet statue and church down in the local mall, everyone's going to be really pushed out of shape about it. And so this new religion cult that's coming in, that's appealing to like women and slaves, and that's weird. We got to worry about all this stuff, and who knows what they might be eating babies. I mean, we can't be all sure what they're doing over in there, can we? Yeah, and so little paranoid clusters would have persecutions of Christians periodically, generally not at the emperor level, but more at the governor level.
Yeah, and plus, I don't know if it was bad or more bad than it is now, but even back then, there were so many different theology divisions inside beginning Christianity, even before they got Romanized, that different theologies, this, that, it's hard to keep track of what was what in the early days.
Yeah, there were a variety of local Christianities, both running underground prior to its legalization under Constantine, which is like 285 or somewhere around in there, the 3rd century, as I recall. And then the increasing urge for orthodoxy, because you split up. You had the Roman Church, which was in the gradually declining Western Empire. You had Constantine's imperial church centered at Constantinople, the new capital of the new Rome that he built, that became eventually the Byzantine Empire. You had what at the time was an immensely powerful Alexandrian church. That's where St. Augustine comes from, in that area, that eventually got sidelined between the fistfights going on between the papacy in Rome and the patriarchs of Constantinople. A lot of political infighting going on that took place over centuries. It was not way longer than the time we can see in the Protestant Reformation to today, just double that. And that's the time frame you're looking at in the gradual fragmentation and consolidation of political regimes that was going on in Europe and in Asia Minor and in the Byzantine Empire.
Do we know when, like, say, the Catholic, when the Pope became a political as well as a religious leader?
Oh, if memory serves me, they really started having papal estates and papal land and papal armies only really starting in the fairly late Middle Ages. Would that be your take, Dapper?
Well, so it's a little complicated because at the event of the fall of the Roman Empire, right? Most people in what was the Western Roman Empire thought of this as more of an interregnum than an actual collapse of the polity of the Roman Empire in the West. And so as early as, some of the first raids by various Gothic Germanic tribes into Rome, the Pope was the person who ended up speaking for the city and negotiating with these various people and trying to get them to either go away or integrate into the countryside or do anything but sack the city. And so that's de facto
didn't
political
talk
power.
To the Vandals or Visigoths, they actually talked them out of invading.
Yeah, and this is actually before the schism between the Eastern and Western churches. So around that time, basically right from the fall of Rome on, the Pope is taking on de facto political power while still trying to maintain the idea that there's supposed to be an emperor who is going to be in charge of things like security and the legions and whatnot, and that the Pope is supposed to be in charge of things like the spiritual well-being of the city and the wider Western Roman Empire, and then varying degrees increasing as we go through the centuries.
Remember
for the
literacy
entire Christian
angle of the
world.
monks. And that was a structure, Latin as a lingua franca that educated people would know, and that was the language of the church. God wrote in Latin, didn't he? And so that's
something that's going to be unique to the West, the Western Empire. That's not going to be.
It'd be Greek over in Constantinople.
Well, not necessarily, because one of the things is the Eastern churches were always big on providing translations into local languages. So that's why in the East, the liturgical language of various churches is not always Greek. So, for instance, the Slavic churches
very different.
Yeah,
very
so the Slavic
different
churches,
Catholicism and even Protestantism. It was a big fighting issue starting in 1300s on as to whether or not Western Christians should be able to read the Bible in their native language or not, and people would get killed for it.
Yes, whereas in the East, the practice had always been to make new translations when new groups of people convert. So that's why the Slavic churches use Church Slavonic. That's why the Coptic churches use Coptic. That's why the Armenian churches use Armenian. The Greek churches use Greek. The Ethiopian and Eritrean churches use, I believe they use Ge'ez. And so that's the reason for that, is because that unilingual focus was unique to the Western Roman Empire.
Did the transition in other languages also some influence in how, like maybe you get a different denomination by using a different language, or mostly faithful to the?
To some extent. So when the Rus in Kiev were considering converting to Christianity, there were Latin and Greek missionaries there. And according to the stories that come down in the Eastern Orthodox Church, and there aren't very many stories that come down in the Western Church, but according to those stories, one of the deciding factors between the Kievan Rus going with the Eastern churches as opposed to the Western churches was that the Eastern churches were willing to allow them to worship in their native language, whereas the Catholics were not. And that is cited, at least by these accounts, which...
And remember, the Rus were Norse who had gone far and wide, so they were already an elite group that had traditions going back in addition to the local people.
The Norse origin of the Kievan Rus is contentious.
I'll have to look into that then.
Yeah, it's one of those things where it's like there are lots of stories about that, but the physical and linguistic evidence is a bit scarce on the ground for that being a truthful claim.
Yeah, but if you want to know more about how languages affect stuff, go back and watch the episode that Dapper starred in about languages a few weeks ago.
Yeah, I remember, of course, not evidence for changing, but the reason for my question was I remember the movie. I know how it's called. It's with William Neeson, I think, where you have these missionaries going to Japan, and the local Japanese they totally misinterpret Christianity because they don't know the language of
there was a very thorny interaction in general between Western missionaries all through that Asiatic world, and to what extent that they were just coming in with gunboats versus just sending missionaries in. It was the Portuguese church as well as Roman Catholics and from Spain and others. And there was now political pecking orders as to who was going to break in to the Japanese culture. Eventually, the Americans brought in their gunboats in the 19th century to open up stuff. So that there's an awful lot of stuff going on there. The Japanese, in response, in part, established the Shinto imperial cult with the new regime in the 1870s, suppressing samurai, suppressing other bits because the emperor worship was politically suitable for them in the Shinto cult.
So the reason why it transitioned from a clan samurai-based rule to an imperial-based rule is because Christians...
you can never extricate politics, economics, religion, social cultures, a whole bunch of layers of stuff. I think there's hardly any example that you can look at that isn't much more complicated than the kind of cartoon that would be turned into a Richard Gere movie.
And that wasn't just Christianity either. Like the early Islam, even the Ottoman Empire, you had three choices. You can convert to Islam if you're Christian, Jew. I think maybe there's another one. The Persian cult maybe was kind of based on it too.
Zoroastrianism?
Yeah, maybe that might be.
There were a few religions at various times that weren't Christianity or Judaism that were extended privileges as so-called religions or peoples of the book, and at various times it included Zoroastrians and Hindus and
you had to pay a tax though that Muslims
Mandaeans. Yes, so you did have to pay a tax. In exchange, though, you were exempt from being drafted into the military, although when the tax sometimes includes, we're going to take, every once in a while, we're just going to take your sons, castrate them, forcibly convert them to Islam, and make them slaves. I don't know whether or not that's worth the exemption from the draft, but, Yeah,
and that same cross-fertilization of mechanisms, the giant Ming fleet that was sailing temporarily around the Indian Ocean and that exploring with these monster junks. The admiral involved was a Muslim eunuch in the court of the Chinese that was running this mission. So there's an awful lot of layers to find out how people are operating within this structure. Well, anyway, we're veering away from religion, state issues.
But even we'll say fast, even not really, because even that one, sometimes those people could even become a vizier or grand vizier. I think I've heard about that.
Another factor to remember with Islam is they went through a reverse process than Christianity in the West. Christianity in the West started out largely dominated by the Roman Catholic Church with very little competition, and then went through a Protestant Reformation. The Islamic system kind of started out as a fragmentary, read the book, it doesn't matter what practices other than just this rule set. And then only later does the Shiite version, which is a lot more like Roman Catholicism in that it has intercessory saints, prayers, and a whole bunch of layer pecking orders of things that are much more like Roman Catholicism than they are Protestantism. So their process is kind of backwards in terms of how the systems develop.
Like I felt like I vaguely remember like that there was like the Islamic world used to be like a more or less a liberal world, like where you have
it had its ups and downs.
In the golden age of Islam, like you had like the trade with the knowledge between different regions.
There was no single regime. Yeah. That was an important factor.
Yeah,
it wasn't like the imperial system where the emperor ran things from Constantinople and everybody had to toe the line. Yeah. That, except in some caliphates and various ups and downs, by and large, there were independent states that only shared the Islamic faith across that spectrum. And so in those cultures, they tended to have a greater degree of toleration. You found this playing out on a ping pong basis regarding how Jews were treated in Spain, where sometimes the Moors were very tolerant, sometimes the Christians were remarkably tolerant, sometimes the Moors were not tolerant, sometimes the Christians were not tolerant. So the Jews would bounce back and forth as to which part of the Iberian Peninsula they were living in, as to who was persecuting them less.
And when the Christians were not tolerant in Spain, you got the Spanish Inquisition, which nobody.
So by that time. By then, you're in a state where there's been a unified state, and they now ran the entire show. And there was a state-enforced orthodoxy. That's a whole side little issue. And of course, they imported that into their gigantic colonial system in the country. That then figures in some of our attitudes towards these former colonies by the time we get down into the 19th and the 20th centuries in relation to the Latin American states. And then by then you've mixed in a new religion, Marxism, that adds yet another layer of complaints going on as to what people regard as ideal systems and whatnot. So isn't it fun how much you have to pay attention to?
Yeah, and we already mentioned with part of the Pilgrims and the Puritans coming over. They wanted religious freedom for themselves, but if anyone inside their colonies that wanted it, they're like, no, you're a witch. Like maybe you're a witch, whatever. We're gonna burn you. Or you're exiled.
Well, William Penn, his Pennsylvania, by contrast, was a much more tolerant state, and you found islands in Europe that had the same matter. The Netherlands had a tradition of toleration in some respects because they had been a ping pong going back and forth with the Habsburgs and the Spanish control and French and everybody else. And they were building up a tradition of business and commerce and everybody mind their own business thing that had an effect on why an awful lot of free thinkers and scientific minds that might be finding it troublesome to live in Paris or London or Rome could settle in Amsterdam and do their stuff relatively free from interference.
So why do you think it is in the United, at least and maybe other countries too, but at least in the United States, the first thing that came out, they just a lot of people don't only think of half of this, that they decide the government is not going to affect the religion.
Oh well, there's your wonderful books that many people have written on the history of the founding fathers and what their motivations were, the concerns they had about how republics and democracies can go wrong, what happens when any religion gets in charge. They could see that there was a all too popular history of how everything had been a mess. When you are living in the late 18th century that started to kind of settle down from the very tumultuous religion wars of the 17th century, that's comparatively fresh on your mind in the same way we would still have a freshness of awareness of what was going on in World War I and the Civil War. That's a ways ago, but it's at about the same time frame in terms of that. And we're still dealing with the impressions of what was going on in those conflicts. So all of that was very mindful for Thomas Jefferson and James Madison and John Adams. And all of these people were very mindful and wrote extensively on the dislike they had for state religions. Catholicism was partly the focus of that. They were coming from a Protestant frame, but they could see what was going on with the still active Spanish Empire. They could see what was going on with the very dictatorial French Roman Catholics, their persecution of Huguenots, and of course the 30 Years' War that had gone on between Protestants and Catholics that tore Germany apart. So they said, no, that's not for us. That yes, we have religions of varying stripes over here, and that should be personal matter. And so you started seeing Thomas Jefferson writing a great deal about this in Virginia while it was still a colony, to have the idea of religious freedom and protection of such things. And that got effectively read into the Constitution, where when the Constitution was adopted, there were Protestant conservatives of the 18th century that didn't want the Constitution to be ratified because it doesn't mention God. It doesn't thank Jesus Christ for the bountifuls in this. And so there was an awful lot of opposition to that. But that's the system that was developed. And over the course of the early 19th century, even the states that had official sanctioned state churches started giving all of that up as there was an increasingly secularized operation. That might have gone a different road if we had not started acquiring lots of Western colonies, if there had not been a huge influx of immigration from other countries, often Catholic. Also, if we hadn't have had to deal with the slavery issue, where religion was playing a different layered role about the divide that was splitting up. The reason why there's a Southern Baptist Convention is because a conservative Southern Baptist didn't want to give up their slaves, so they just leave the Baptist Convention altogether at the time of the Confederacy forming. So you've got multiple factors that are feeding in racism about particular ethnic groups, fear of change as the religions alter. There have been a huge Protestant revivalism in Methodism in the 18th century and another great big revival in the early 19th century. You've got a new religion altogether with the Mormons that were popping up in the 1830s. That was a very violent and tumultuous time. They were getting martyred and killed, and they had to run off to Utah in the 19th century. All of this, what gets people on edge is tumultuous change. And whether it's going on in the settlement of the United States and how we deal with Native Americans who have a different religion entirely, and what you have with foreigners coming in, all of this is when you get people on edge, and that's when people want to hunker down and preserve the tradition, and that's when they can start oppressing people and saying, no, you got to believe the way we used to.
I have a question. Like you mentioned Native Americans, and I would suspect that the early settlers were not very fond of the Native Americans, but
very not.
Yeah, but I was wondering, like, if I'm not mistaken, some of the names of places in the U.S. are derived from Native American languages, right? Or am I mistaken with that?
Enormous one. I live in Spokane, Washington, named for the Spokane Indians. Yeah. We have Chowila, we have Issaquah, we have just a pile up of Native American names in this area.
Why did these settlers they hated the natives, but why did they retain the names of the places?
We're fairly late in the settlement game. If you start looking in other areas in the East, in some cases you just have forgotten where the name came from and you adopt it and forget all about it. In other cases, it's just they didn't bother about the trouble. I mean, look at all the American settlers who start swarming into former Spanish colonies, and they just keep the names: San Antonio, Las Vegas, Los Angeles, and they just act, okay, that's ours now, and they simply co-opt it. In other areas, there are place names and things that got changed over to where Mount Denali was called Mount Whitney for quite a long time, because that was, you would name people for Western and U.S. Figures. That started to change. It's a complex mixture of things, and we get into that very fuss in the changeover on the Cleveland Indian baseball team, where they're having fuss, and you find Donald Trump having a conniption fit over it. But the Native Americans are not so thrilled about this, and it's time we change all of that. And nothing cuts at our perception of things more than what we use for words and names for things. And that's why it inevitably is going to cause consternation. Imagine if we decided to rename something that has been named, if we decided to rename Washington, D.C. or my state of Washington, because we suddenly decided that Washington was unacceptable, and we'd have to change all the maps, we'd have to change all the things, all of the, and it would be a gigantic bureaucratic nightmare. In the same way, if we decide to add more flags to the Union by making more states.
Yeah, I think city names have only been changed a few times in history. Think of a second. Like my city was named after the Gothic Germans, the Vandals. But yeah, I think
and the fact also the issue of who gets to call what it is, we still get important issues about whether the Arabian Gulf is to be called the Arabian Gulf or not, as to who has control over it. The South China Sea is contentiously named because the Chinese regard that in one way, and Taiwan and the United States and Japan regard it in a different way.
I think
so what things are called can have huge consequences.
Yeah, I think that one of the most recent ones, we forget that topic, was St. Petersburg and Leningrad, or I think it was.
Oh, exactly. Yes. Here you had St. Petersburg. That was the name for Peter the Great, the monarch, and that stayed the same as this westernized city built on basically swampland there with a bunch of canals. And then in the Russian Revolution, it's renamed for Lenin. And you also had this Volgograd that was named for Stalin. That was Stalingrad for quite a while. That switched back when the regime falls, and they put it back to where it used to be.
I think Leningrad is the better name, St. Petersburg.
Well. And I still think of
sounds more Russian than
the Leningrad Symphony. No one's ever going to call it the St. Petersburg Symphony.
Yeah, it sounds more Russian than St. Petersburg.
But also back to the government and religion stuff. A lot of, at least some people think they don't know it works both. Some people don't know it works both ways. They think the government. They're happy that the government can tell them how to worship. But then they want they also want to have their way of thinking into the government.
Yeah. The abortion issue, in which the government is to dictate how a woman deals with her own body, but the government can't dictate with your body if it wants to tell you not to wear a mask in a pandemic, and you get weird double standards going on in this area. That another factor where show you how recent this phenomenon is. The whole abortion fracas is a product of the 19th century, that it's not actually driven by any theological grounding. It became one of the major doctrines in the Catholic Church over a time, and then conservative Protestants picked up that element, and it kicked into high gear in the 1970s, which is not that long ago. And they've now tried to retrofit the idea that abortion prohibitions were somehow built into the Bible. That's not historically accurate.
Let me tell you a story. It's called what's the chapter again? Like there was one chapter in the Bible where it says like how you can make use an abortion as a test for fidelity. Like
basically, you weren't alive in the Judaic religion until you were breathing.
Right.
And also, that was the official marker on it. The primary reference that I'm aware of where they really try to pin abortion in the Bible is the "I knitted you together in the womb" line, which I think comes from Isaiah.
I think it was Jeremiah.
Okay, one of those books.
But yeah, even like our current president, I think he went on thing and says, "I personally don't like abortion, but I'm not telling anybody what to do." Because he's a
and that's the case with most of the presidents. We've had pro-choice people, and the Democratic Party has been pretty much officially pro-choice from that point of view. Whereas it's very difficult to be pro-choice in the Republican Party, and increasingly so. And since the culture camp conservatives basically took over the Republican Party, this was the case before Donald Trump then shrank it even more into a personality cult. It's now become basically a litmus test. And to where this is regarded as goodness, anti-abortion, and then this also brings in the legal issues and the interventions of the state, in that there are all these little around the corner rules that have tried to maneuver around Roe v. Wade to make it functionally impossible to do abortions, even if it's technically legal, by restrictions on what kind of medical services have to be performed in such a way that it's just making it as difficult as possible for them to do it in practice. A lot of calculation going on here.
Okay, Dapper, you've been quiet for a while. I'll let you have a time to the talk about all the stuff we brought up so far?
Well, I mean, it certainly is the case that people's religious stance remains a strong indicator of a lot of their policy positions. Like RJ was saying, you can, to a large degree, determine someone's stance on abortion based on their religious affiliation. You can tell to a large degree what kinds of things they're going to want in sex ed or science classrooms based, again, on their religious affiliation. But it's also the case that in a lot of places in the West, less so in the United States, but religion is becoming a less important aspect of politics in terms of one's own religious affiliation. But there are still places where the religious affiliation of other people has some impact on positions. So, for instance, there are a lot of various parties in a lot of European countries who are suspicious of immigration from predominantly Muslim countries. And so we have an odd situation where membership in those parties is not strongly indicated by your religion. It's indicated instead by how you feel about other people's religion.
Yeah.
Yeah, and we have also at least one particular party here in the Netherlands as well. And the party leader is our version of Donald Trump.
Yeah,
and
Hungary
so
is another area. There's been a lot of long-standing seething frustrations about this because when you deal with particularly political ideologues, they sometimes have a really long memory where you go, whoa, give it a rest. But all of that area in Eastern Europe was run by the Ottoman Empire up until the 19th century and into the 20th century. And so it's close enough in terms of what your grandparents did or the great-grandparents did, that those issues that were playing a role, remember the massacre that the Turks did on our people in Serbia in 1908, this stuff is constantly seething in their memories in kind of the same way that we have of people who are still trying to refight the Civil War, or others that are paying attention or not to the expulsion of the Cherokees to Oklahoma during the Jackson administration. So that gives you a sense of a time frame that cultures in general can have a couple 150 or even 200 year anxiety window of the past that could affect how they are behaving today.
Real fast, I'm curious about one thing. We talked about off topic real fast. We talked about your city and my city. Dapper, what was your city named after anything?
My city?
Yeah, what ours was. His
well,
was
so
Indian.
my hometown was named after an Israelist, not a religious figure. Yeah, so it was named after something, just nothing to do with this topic.
Yeah, and that shows the change to where our country has a somewhat different dynamic. You get a little bit of that. There was, in fact, a town suburb in Germany called Zeppelinheim, named for where they built the airships down there in southern Germany, and that can occur. But here, where we have Andrew Carnegie and Rockefeller and Henry Ford and James Hill, the Northern Pacific Railroad or Great Northern Railroad guy, that you start having a lot of industrialists that play a role in that, and Pullman, the Pullman car company, that was a Pullman would be thought of as Jeff Bezos with machine guns. By modern day standards.
Yeah, I think another problem of having government and religion combined together, at least, is the different interpretations of religion they have. They can use it for anything. Like both the North and the South, the slaveholders and the abolitionists both used the Bible for saying slavery is wrong. No, slavery is fine. It's good. It's in the Bible. And they both use their interpretations for their point.
There too, there is a bit of demographics going on, because I have my particular focus that I study how creationists look at these things, and the defining characteristics of a creationist is they're a culture war, Kulturkampf, conservative, religious. Those dynamics all have to be running together. And if you look at the people who were defending slavery from a religion point of view, these are demographically the same kind of hyper-conservative traditionalists who will eventually be prominent in the KKK and in anti-evolution movements in the South in subsequent years. Whereas the people most likely to be religious abolitionists would be classified as much more liberal in their religious persuasion. They're theologically less doctrinal, less prone to belong to conventional denominations, less likely to be Anglicans, as opposed to, say, the extreme case, I suppose, would be the Quakers, that for a long time in the 16 and 1700s had been knee-deep in the slave trade, and they went through a quite wrenching soul search and became vehemently anti-slavery, and that transformed the religious sect in that context. So generally speaking, outlier groups, the Mormons were anti-Catholic and actually have anti-slavery sentiments in there, although they were very racist in terms of their individual beliefs about black people. But that too is an outlier cult. So it's in part, what is the religion of the ruling class versus what is the religion of working people? Yeah,
I would like to point out is that just religious groups that were anti-slavery does not mean that they were anti-racists. So
exactly,
a lot of them were like, well, look. Yeah, so a lot of them were like, we don't think these people are our equals. We just don't think that it's appropriate to enslave them. And I mean, I guess that's a step up.
And
I put it that if I were to guesstimate based on my familiarity with the various figures involved, I would use as a ballpark figure probably 3/4 of the people who were abolitionists in 1860 were still functionally racist and did not believe in the equality of the races.
Yeah. Didn't Abraham Lincoln actually say that black people shouldn't vote at least, or
well, in the early years he was coming from of that frame and retained that view quite a ways along until he actually started talking to suddenly I've forgotten the name of
Frederick Douglass.
Stephen Douglas, who Donald Trump thought was still alive. They should put up a monument to it.
Well,
kinda.
Well, I mean, I wouldn't object to a monument. I mean,
I have no problems about that part, but he was not terribly familiar with the character. But anyway, there were actual meetings of things.
Wait, does that mean we just found a pretty good Donald Trump idea?
Yeah, there we go. Yeah.
Okay, well, congratulations, man! You came up with a good idea.
It's a short list.
But a lot of people. I hate to say this, a lot of people have no idea what things are until they actually go there and meet the people. It's like, oh my god, I didn't even know that. It's been happening for hundreds of years. There are some people are their own world for the longest time. They don't know what's happening outside the bubble.
Yeah, although it's not a universal panacea, that it's harder to be prejudicial about people that you actually meet and see. And that's one of the downsides of the internet era, when you can be anonymous, and it tends to embolden extremism. It tends to embolden vitriol because you don't get a direct, you will say in a tweet what you might never say to that person to their face.
Yeah, I definitely try. I don't always succeed, but I definitely try to make sure that when I say something to someone in some kind of digital format or something like that, it's something that I would say to them in person. And that doesn't always mean it's nice, but it's usually not as vitriolic as it could.
Now we should probably, on topic, discuss the legal issues that were starting to hit the fan in the 1940s on. That's the reason why official state prayer in schools became not the law of the land.
But that's the thing. That's another thing. We talk about that. Yeah, it's like people now, at least on Facebook, are like, bring prayer back to school. I'm like, it never left school. I prayed in school in the 90s by myself, over lunch maybe, whatever.
Yeah, and by that time, it was perfectly, it was quite clear. Absolutely everybody has a complete freedom to pray anytime they like, under any circumstances. What this was talking about was, can the school as an institution, as the teacher, as an authority figure, lead you in that and direct it? No, you can't. You got to stay away from that, because that's an intrusion and an unacceptable one. And that was hitting in rulings in the 1940s on, which the cliche is, oh, Madeline Murray O'Hare, the atheist, was objecting to prayer in the schools. Although she was party to the issue, it was not started by her. And in fact, it was often Jewish families and others that were members of minority religions that didn't like that same point that was brought out between Protestants and Catholics as to which prayer gets used. That's when it hit the fan in the rulings in the 1940s, and then finally up into where it was kind of codified, I think, in a 1960 ruling that settled that in the case. And I happened to be involved, my very first debate, which was quite a few years ago, with a South Dakota law professor over at one of the little Federalist Society clubs at a college in Seattle on the Grease v. Galloway case. This was about whether or not this particular town in New York, Greece, New York, should have an opening prayer at their council meetings or not. And a bunch of people were suing over it, and the ACLU was involved in it. And quite a lot of religious groups were on the side of, you shouldn't have this state-mandated prayer, because there were even one, amazingly enough, one of the figures that was on the side of the ACLU was the guy that was pushing for Ten Commandments monuments all over the place. And even he thought it was inappropriate for a city council to be mandating a sectarian prayer in public that way. Now, when you looked at who was supporting the prayer, I got involved in the debate because it was a positive train wreck of names that I was familiar with from the creationism case. And
Shocker.
so including Jay Sekulows, ACLJ, and all of that there were a pileup of hyper-conservative ideologues who were the ones who were pushing this in the amicus curiae briefs. And it was almost uniform across the board that way. And
now that you mention creationism, can we maybe get into how creationism went through a whole period of let's repackage our story with intelligent design to go into the classroom and circumnavigate the separation.
Yeah, the new marketing, and that involves an interesting demographic shift, because the intelligent design movement, unlike an awful lot of grassroots creationism, which tends to be preacher-driven, theologically driven, you have people who are wanting to convert you right on the spot. There's an academic, elite, collegiate, button-down, Oxford, Cambridge lecture circuit style to the intelligent design movement, even though there's an awful lot of overlap in terms of the concerns they're about. They're almost entirely opposed to abortion. They don't like the idea of same-sex marriage. They don't like the idea of climate science and climate change. That in terms of their content beliefs, there's not a huge amount of difference between them and Jay Sekulows' world, and Pat Robertson, and Ken Ham, and Kent Hovind on an awful lot of these buzzword issues.
A few things got brought up here.
At least Pat Robertson is an old earther. We gotta give him that. Like, it's a weird thing to me, but yeah.
Ken Ham God down on him when he said dinosaurs lived a long time ago.
Yeah, that's all it takes for the young earthers to project, which is interesting. Because the thing is, like, there's even these internal politics in religion, and so even just in the sphere of YouTube creationism, I don't know if you guys know this, but Smokey Saint used to be invited to the various creationist YouTube channels.
Just now,
but then very recently, he's been pointing out that, like, you know, I'm an old Earth creationist, and so myself, Gutsick Gibbon, and Science Side Up ended up on his stream dunking on young Earth, and we didn't cover evolution because, you know, if it's about the age of the Earth, that's what we're going to stick to. Yeah, suddenly now he's been like excommunicated from the YouTube creationist.
And that was exactly the concern that the founding fathers were well aware of, was the notion of sectarian infighting that could go on. And you find this in a lot of different contexts. You find it in doctrinal Marxism, the lethal disputes between the official Bolshevik Marxists and what was the got assassinated down there in Mexico? Yipes! I've suddenly.
I feel like a lot of people have been assassinated in Mexico. So
well, that's true. Yeah. Oh gosh. Yeah. I'll think of it eventually. But anyway, that there were doctrinal schisms that operate in that political frame that are not dissimilar to what goes on in religion, and it all involves the idea that you can use the power of the state to enforce orthodoxy. We're seeing this with the Uyghurs and re-education camps in China. Same problem.
Yeah, we brought a lot of stuff. I brought up. I want to bring up like the principal thing. People that I think they're fine when their religion in the area is the majority, but if they became if they're the minority, like say like Islam people came over all out in the city, and they're the majority in the city, they'd be like no, freedom of religion. We can't let the Islam people or the Hindu people preach in our schools, but when they're the majority, they're fine for prayer in school. Their prayer thing, they're the majority.
Oh yeah, and in fact, that satanic church thing uses this as a deliberate trope. That okay, you believe in freedom of religion, really? Okay, well then we get to put up our statue of Satan, right?
Yeah.
Well, to be fair, they have put up some statues of Satan.
Yeah, and they're always thumbing their nose, and how many of them are actually Satan worshipers is problematic. But the point is that they're showing the hypocrisy and the absurdity of it. It should be pointed out demographically that the vast majority of people on the planet believe in the religion of their local group. And this is the one outlier here is Buddhism. Of all the religion groups, and there are about 500 million Buddhists on the planet, huge chunks of them don't live in countries where they're in the majority. But that's not true of all the other religions.
Aren't Satanists more like just atheists who uses Satan as a symbol rather than an actual?
To some extent, especially the modern brand of it. Yeah,
that is the official position of like the Church of Satan that you get these things like the statues and stuff from. They're typically atheists who have a particular
1870s Satanists,
idea.
Slightly different viewpoint.
There are also still religious Satanists who believe that Satan is a supernatural being and who, in fact, worship him. But the counterpoint there is that they then will usually say that Satan, as represented in traditional Christian and Jewish and Islamic theology, is basically inverted, and so like he's not actually an evil guy. He's actually the one who against God because God was unwilling to give humans their freedom or their ability to grow to their fullest potential, and he wanted them to. So
it's the same kind of thing with Wicca. That's another syncretic religion that probably owes very little to any actual traditions that are knocking around in Celtic culture, and all of it has just been assembled over the years.
Where did the imagery of like the red guy with horns and pointy tail come from? Like
medieval demonology.
Yeah.
All right.
Okay.
Yeah. So
before we continue real fast, I could give if anybody's watching in chat has questions they want to, you can ask them. We'll try to answer them.
Ooh, absolutely.
And then also, is this the reason why people like Kithoven and stuff are trying to get like evolution as religion so that they can like say, oh, you can't teach it because it's a religion and government don't teach religion.
Yeah. So
in part, and that's gone way back. That goes back into Henry Morris era in the 1960s and 70s. This has been a trope going way back in creationism.
So at this point, a lot of creationists have realized that there's essentially no hope for getting creation into school. So the next best thing that they could do is to get evolution out. So that way, at least, none of the students from their churches that go to schools will have their faith challenged by evolution. And the easiest way to get something out of schools right now is for it to be declared a religious doctrine that you can no longer, you can't promulgate it. You might be able to teach about it. For instance, in public schools, you can teach about world religions. When I was in public schools, I had classes about like, okay, look, here are some major world religions and what their basic beliefs are. Because it's a handy thing to know, right? You're going to run into people who follow these religions in your life, so it's nice to know the first thing about them.
And they have gone from teach the alternative to if I can't teach it, then you can't teach it either.
Kind of like 17-year locusts. every once in a while, some religious ideologue will file a lawsuit saying they should be throwing evolution out of the schools because it is a religion, and it immediately slams into a court ruling where they say, "Goodbye, don't bother us."
Yeah. I mean, at this point, lawsuits with that contention should probably just be automatically dismissed with prejudice. There's so much case precedent to say no, evolution is science, even if you don't like it.
Well,
even
kind
if
of
it's
like
not
Kent Hovind and his $500 million lawsuit for wrongful imprisonment.
Oh, man,
that one also was
goodness.
dismissed as "Don't bother me, kid."
Yeah, that was hilarious. I liked it. The judge said that it displayed the frivolous and delusional nature of the lawsuit. Like, don't let a judge call you frivolous and delusional, guys. It's a really bad time.
Yeah. When you get a judge who's that blunt, you should really rethink your entire worldview.
Yeah.
When the guy that wrote the lawsuit probably the same. I wonder if he started this lawsuit the same way he started his thesis.
He did not. I actually did read the initial complaints, so it does read. The format overall does look like a fairly standard legal document. I think that the person who prepared it was in fact a lawyer, but when you start reading into the actual substance of the complaints, it just goes to straight crazy town.
It's not unlike the various stuff that Trump's lawyers were putting up during the election challenges. That they had the structure of a legal argument, but no substance there, and tended to have judges go.
Yeah, in fact, that's actually why Rudy Giuliani has currently been suspended from the New York and DC Bar Association. He is currently not allowed to practice law.
Yeah. He has fallen a long way from his 9/11 days.
Yeah, and that is rather sad. That there is somebody whose reputation is self-inflicted immolation. That if he had just rested, this is worse even than poor Herbert Hoover, who should have quit while he was ahead and not become president in 1928.
Unfortunately, guys, I think I have to get going.
Me too. I think I will also go.
Please enjoy.
You got a bunch of questions there. Yeah. We can fill out the question time.
All right.
Well, anyways, thanks for being on there. Next week, watch his after show if he still does it. It's gonna be
it'll be whenever the debate happens. That's when I'll do the after show. So who knows?
And if you're another dinosaur out there, get your damn top hat.
What debate? Which debate?
RJ's debating somebody on the Titanic if it's
this one is probably it had been thought that it might have been today, but it will if it occurs at all. It may be next week, where it's still kind of iffy in the air as to how the structure.
Are you going to debate whether the Titanic happened?
Oh, there's a bunch of nutball conspiracy thinking that the Titanic was flipped out with the Olympic, its sister ship, and it was sunk for an insurance scam or because of some evil plot to get rid of some of the people on board who were opposed to the Federal Reserve. There are various just off-the-wall stupid scenarios here, all of which snag on the teeny tiny, spoiler alert, the ships were not identical. I don't think these clowns realize the Olympic and the Titanic could be told apart. They're not identical ships.
I never heard of that conspiracy theory ever.
Oh, it is. If flat Earth is a fringe movement, the Titanic conspiracy is like 1/1000th of the credibility and range of flat Earth. It's just a pimple on the back ass of stupid. But there are tiny number of people who have this. And when it was brought to my attention, would you like to have a debate on this? I said, oh yes, this is an area about which I know very well is the ins and outs of the Titanic. I've been studying this thing for the last 50 years.
All right. Thanks for having me. I also go because it's 1 a.m. here. So yeah.
I need to sleep.
Yeah. Good night, Ness.
Bye.
I also talked about RJ. We mentioned this a little bit in when we talked about it in our politics episode, but when do you think it was? I don't know, it was recently or a long time ago that the right side or the Republican side, at least in modern days, focus more on religious issues than they have before.
Oh, this has been within my lifetime. that even somebody who is a very politically conservative guy, Goldwater, literally made no mentions to God in his acceptance speeches at the convention in 1964. It just wasn't a thing. And that was pretty much, there were occasional light references to it. But the efforts by hyper-conservatives in the Ralph Reed wing of Republicanism really made a positive campaign in the 1980s on to take over the Republican Party. So it's that recent. So the hyper-conservatism of the Republican Party has taken place in the same time frame that VCRs became public. That's the window. And then it has now imploded even farther because you already had a shrunken Republican Party in the period after George Bush won into the George Bush II period. And then along comes hyper-opportunist Trump, who just basically pours oil on the fires whenever he can to take over and dominate the exchange from that point of view. And that's when the buzzwords about building the wall and the anti-immigrationism and the demonization of various groups and the media and all of that went into high gear. And that's when people who would have been run out of the Republican Party, John Birch Society types back in those 1960s era, are now embraced. So people like Marjorie Taylor Greene and Cruz and Getz, these are such extremist nutballs that that's now kind of too much of the normal Republican Party. So that's how recent all of this is.
Yeah, I think at least from my memory, at least I think it was the mid '90s during the Clinton administration that at my church at the time they started posting pamphlets, papers about the people running for president on the Republican side, at least, like, oh, well, for these guys, they're anti-abortion, they're pro.
Someone to pay attention to is Tony Perkins, who is a young Earth creationist, Ken Ham style, who is connected to this Council on National Policy that is a veritable who's who of the movers and shakers in the current Republican Party Wackaloon division. And all of that has been operating to get their little tendrils in for the last 30 years. And in the last 10 or 20 have really become the dominant factor involved in there. So you can research that and find out the scorecard of the people knocking around, and everybody has to pay obeisance to all of that. Then it kicked into personality cult because Donald Trump comes along and makes everybody have to pay attention to his version of it. Otherwise, you are an anathema and a rhino, to where Liz Cheney, who by any measurement is a very conservative Republican, is suddenly just a rhino, almost Democrat. Why? Because she voted to impeach Donald Trump the second time around and is now an anti-Trump person. Everything about her is hyper-conservative, but not that. So now it's just a Trump party.
I think that at the time, I think before, I didn't see the writing on the wall. I didn't care because at the time I couldn't vote anyway. So like whatever, I don't care about politics. They can do whatever. But as I got older, I'm like, they still started doing this. I'm like, wait a minute, wait, tell me how to vote.
Yeah.
Everybody
should read up on the history of what actually happened in politics, and then beyond when they were born into the past, because an awful lot of what we see knocking around as issues has a pedigree to it. The complaints about whether or not you have immigration, you were having Mexican Americans being thrown out of the country in the 1930s in purges. You had another wave of it going on during the Eisenhower years in the 1950s. And now we still have this kind of obsession going on in the 21st century that is knee deep in prejudice and ignorance and xenophobia. Ann Coulter, Laura Ingraham on Fox News. These are all people that just bang this drum obsessively. They're one notch shy of eye-twitching hysteria on this. And this is the drumbeat that goes on at Foxtrum Pravda, as I like to call it, and then the even more conservative Newsmax, that is a news agency in the same way Pravda and the People's Republic of China have news agencies, and then OANON, which is also basically a right-wing propaganda network. They look like a news thing, but they're not real. And all of this has been accelerating in just recent times in the media, internet era.
Yeah, maybe it's guessing here. I might be wrong, but it seems like sometimes that the people that say they're pro this or pro that, they're really not. They only care. They just want you to say that for buzzwords. So they get that religious side of the vote for them.
Some are opportunists. I think there's an awful lot of opportunists about Lindsey Graham and Ted Cruz and Mitch McConnell who are power brokers and want to keep that way. And so there are people who have been leveling criticism against Donald Trump who then start sucking up to him because they want to maintain that power base. And Trump has marshaled a power base in the Republican Party that is real. He got more people to vote for him in 2020 than he had in 2016. That is an accomplishment. And it could be argued that the Republicans lost less than they might have had that voter base not been energized. This is not a nice thing to be proud of because they vote in idiots like Marjorie Taylor Greene. This is not a good for the Republic, but from a political, self-interested point of view, it's very much a positive from their perspective.
And also, real fast, when I say questions, I mean questions that deal with the topic of the video name, not random topics.
Yeah, you get to filter all of that. Although, if somebody has an incendiarily stupid question, I can give a vitriolic and annoying answer.
Here's the question.
Well, gravity is so strong that how can birds fly? Gravity is so strong that nothing should be able to move. I suggest you do experimentation on how incredibly weak gravity is. It's the weakest of the force, that electromagnetism that has a cube relationship rather than a square relationship, the way gravity does. When you have finished your monograph on this subject, Robert, do let all the people who have physics degrees and Nobel Prizes know. And if any of them is convinced of your position, let us know on that too. I will not be holding my breath. Oh, and why is gravity just a theory? Because science theories are the top level of analysis. Please get caught up on the nomenclature. There are many arguments that are serious and intelligent in this area. The one you just gave isn't one of them.
Yeah.
Is that vitriolic enough, Van?
Yeah. Sure. All right. So let's see.
Yeah.
Europe. Too bad that's here anymore. We talk more of that, but it seems like I could be wrong about this. It seems like we're technically a secular nation, but we talk about religion more. And Europe might be more religious, but they're more secular than we are. I think sometimes
it's an interesting. Well, actually, that's an extremely interesting variable. Is an argument can be made that one of the reasons why we have such a large proportion of very devout religious people is because we do not have a secular or a government that mandates religion. That it is precisely because we have that separation of state structure that people can believe what they like, and that there's a detail of it. That the ones who are so much for prayer in the schools fail to recognize the stultifying effect of that in the past. Yes, thank the Father in heaven, hallowed be thy name, blah, 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 yada, yada, yada. You go through the motions of the prayer that you are mandated to do, and you don't give a thing about it. Cultures that have established religions in that way often are paper thin in terms of actual piety.
Yeah.
And
I think
unless you can enforce orthodoxy to where you can get your head chopped off if you don't do that, that's what happens in a lot of Islamic extremist states. Then you pretend to believe it. But in a society where you cannot be forced to believe in a religion, that all of your religious choices are your doing, not the state, that by definition, it's people are going to believe what they believe in because they actually believe it, not because they are mandated by the state. So it can be argued that we have an empirical measure that state orthodoxy efforts actually don't further religion. And that we could argue that our secular safeguards on freedom of conscience are religion's best friend, because it means that your individual faith that you have cannot be dictated by the state, and you will be protected in that. But you can't mandate it for anybody else if you get in charge and become president of the United States. That don't work.
Yeah, like I said, mentioned earlier, like our current president said that he doesn't believe in abortion personally, but he's not going to tell anyone else what to do.
Yeah. Well, of the three presidents recently, Biden, Trump, and Obama, the one in there who is extremely likely to have no religious convictions at all is Trump. He pretends to be religious, but I know religious people. If you ask them what scripture do you draw on, they'll tell you. That's because they believe it. But Donald Trump, when asked point blank by interviewers from Christianity Today, gave the book review from the kid that never read the book, who said, "Oh, no, this is too personal. I don't want to get into that." Oh, bullpucky. No, because he doesn't pay any attention to that. He doesn't read the Bible. I barely can hold one up straight. And the people who really do believe in a religion can tell you about it, and they are anxious to do so.
But yeah, wasn't he the? I forget. I was upside down. I might be wrong remembering this. Maybe I'm just biased here. But like after he gassed the protesters, the preacher protesters in front of a church to hold a Bible photo op, was it upside down or something?
Yeah. Well, there was some dispute over that. But at any rate, if he's ever cracked the Bible open, I would be amazed that there's no. Well, for one thing, Trump is very possibly dyslexic. So he's not a reader anyway, and that's why he goes into meltdown mode if you try to put a thing underneath his eyeballs that's longer than 4 pages. That this is not something he does very well. He has a very limited vocabulary. He was probably an undiagnosed dyslexic, and of which there have been other people. Nelson Rockefeller, who ran for president, he was one of those liberal Republicans back in the day. He was dyslexic, and so it pops up. Not dyslexia, but it is something that I always bear in mind when listening to President Biden, is that he's a stutterer. And particularly if there's nervous moments or he's thinking an issue through, there could be a thing where he seems to be stumbling for words. Well, it's not necessarily because he doesn't understand what is going on, it's that he's stuttering. And it's something that you never quite get over. You can manage it, but you can never quite get over it. Meanwhile, Donald Trump is probably never going to get over being a narcissistic ignoramus. This is something I can't imagine that he's ever going to be able to remedy because he's had 70 years to do it.
Yeah. Also, I was my train of thought, but you can talk about. You mentioned. I can't remember. When I try to remember my train of thought, was there any other religion, politics in America, of the world that you can remember?
Oh, is kind of interesting. Yes. Functionally, it's only been a pitch battle between Protestants and Catholics. Now, you can have varying political dynamics of that as to political conservatism or not, but that's it pretty much. Now, in some areas where you would have, for a while, Minneapolis was run for about 50 years by a socialist mayor. Literally, a socialist mayor. That was in the day when socialists were actively running for president and being governors and a whole bunch of things that had a much big market penetration of 100 years ago than it is now. And in that respect, it would have been much more secular, and you would have had a presence of Jews and liberal Christians altogether, and free-thinking non-believers entirely going on in there. But other than that, you haven't had you get some minor blips. There was the Rajesh cult or whatever. It was an odd offshoot of Hinduism that took over a town in Oregon, I think back in the 1970s and 80s. That they gradually gained control of all of the city council seats and basically made it a little baby theocracy. There was that didn't end well, but those stand out as really exceptions to the rule. That you basically have a battle between a liberal, more inclusive brand of Christianity and a conservative, more exclusivist, nativist, often white Protestant, but not exclusively. That another factor that we should be recalling here is the broadening of the scale. You've heard of Judeo-Christian tradition, right? Well, that's a relatively recent way of putting it, because if you were 100 years ago or 150 years ago, there's only the Christian tradition and the Jewish Christ killers. And so for many people, they
probably
didn't
even 50 years ago, because when I was saying even probably wasn't until maybe World War II or post World War II, after, because even before then, when they came over here, they're like, to escape Europe, they're like, nah, we don't want you to go away.
Anti-Semitism was still active enough that Hollywood movies would be dealing with the subject in the late 1940s. And things began to change noticeably after that period. But the point is that as you start broadening the field, conservatives now have expanded to co-opt not only Judaism, but also Catholicism. So a huge block of the political conservatives that are on the courts and connected up with that Tony Perkins group and all of that are often Roman Catholics. Pat Buchanan and William Buckley were Roman Catholics, but Ted Cruz is a Roman Catholic, and it's just a long line of ones in that field that 100 years earlier would have been regarded as papists and out of the field.
Yeah.
So that Judeo-Christian bloc, if there hadn't been the terrorism issue and the Palestinian-Israeli thing, as the culture moved and there's more and more secularism to where you have to enlarge the camp, you could have easily developed into Judeo-Christian Islamic tradition.
Yeah, I think it
brought it out even farther to the God of Abraham group.
I think it's like we mentioned earlier about how the abolitionists, even though they hate slavery, they were still probably racist as heck. I think it's probably the same way as some anti-Semitists. They still hate the Jews, but they saw the Holocaust are like, we hate the Jews, but not that much.
Oh yeah, you found that in a lot of areas where there was a public profession of non-anti-Semitism, but personally a lot of racism. Richard Nixon had a lot of that in him. There's little aspects of it to Donald Trump. He's kind of a special case where he's an egalitarian if there's suck-ups. So he doesn't really matter what your religion, creed, race, sex are at any way, or sexual orientation is totally irrelevant if you suck up to him and think he's brilliant. Then you are by definition valuable and worthwhile. Then if you are not for him, then it doesn't matter what your race, color, creed, national origin, or whatever is. You're pathetic and a loser and awful because you don't see how brilliant he is. So there's a personality called narcissism that's different than the kind of attitude that Richard Nixon had coming, who, by the way, came out of a Quaker tradition. That was the family group that he came out of, and also didn't come from inherited money. He was a work from the bootstraps sort that you find. So everybody, your mileage has to vary when it comes to the life stories that people have and how they come to the views they do. And sometimes they make bad decisions because they start losing their way and letting go of their moral compasses and ending up making stupid statements and being a nuisance, which we're seeing in spades with the whole issue about Donald Trump and the Republican Party, and also the anti-vax movement and COVID, where people die.
Which I think might be maybe not overlap, maybe a lot of overlap, but it's the same people. It seems like I think most of the anti-vax people are the, at least nowadays, are the Trump people.
It is not a one-to-one relationship. Yeah. You can have politically liberal Marin County left-wing pro-environment anti-vaxxers.
But that's the thing. That's the thing. You know, for the longest time, I thought all the anti-vaxxers were the far left side. You know, alternative
until this current bit, and that's what. It is a weird phenomenon. Sociologists are going to be fascinated looking into this. There's going to be PhD papers on this, Lamont. Is a group that was praising Donald Trump to the skies for his initiative in getting the vaccines in place, then turn around and refuse to get the vaccines because they're wicked and evil and they're trying to kill us and implant chips and all this other stuff. The gear shift turnaround on this would be just an academic exercise in stupid if it weren't for the fact that this new Delta variant is having a field day. And so you've got a big surge of cases in Florida with its doofus governor there, and in Alabama, Mississippi, and a lot of these other places. It's easier to catch than the standard variant because viruses mutate.
Yeah,
And they don't give a rat's ass about your political affiliation.
I have a question for you. I know it's more like an opinion, I guess. Maybe fact too or not. But do you think, I mean, viruses mutate anyways? Do you think it would have been this bad if we had, if people actually had, what's the word, cared or paid attention to this thing,
we don't have to actually guess at this. There are quite a few models that have looked at the interactions of things. Had proper sound policies been taken very early on to initiate targeted social distancing, lots of testing, mask use when needed, people being sent home but still paid, and then a project that would reimburse companies during that period, during the pandemic, so virtually nobody went on unemployment insurance because they were still technically employed. A whole bunch of prudent things that in many respects we ended up doing anyway, willy-nilly piecemeal, but should have been done really early. Probably half of the people who died wouldn't.
Yeah.
So 300,000 easy would not be corpses had proper actions been taken early on.
And
that's a sad truth.
So that maybe the mutations now would be as bad because they would have been like quarantined.
Well, mutations would still have occurred, and the procedures that we're doing now are practices we really are going to have to pay attention to, because this sort of thing's going to happen again eventually. We live in a world in which viruses exist and mutate, and we live in a world of such quick transportation and international connections that a virus that is bumped into by a tourist in some podunk country out in the middle of nowhere, in 48 hours, they can be through 5 different airports and produce a huge amount. Oh, the Delta variant comes from India. They don't have very many vaccines there. In fact, most of the world is under-vaccinated. And this is a major effort. Some of the cases are just because they can't afford it. In other cases, because there's anti-vaxxer traditions going on. Some people have a reluctance to do it because vaccines have been used and medicine has been used in prejudicial ways in other contexts. But at least in the United States, what we've got is a matter of a willfully stupid segment of the population who are imperiling their and other safeties pointlessly, because it's not even like they have to pay money to get a vaccine. It's being given free.
Yeah, I think in some countries they want the vaccine, they don't have enough of it. We have so much of the vaccine, we can't give it away.
Yeah, well, to some extent, we are shipping ones before they expired in other countries, and the Biden administration has done a lot on that. But nonetheless, one of the things that have affected Australia, for example, is they did full-blown lockdown approach, which was a nice thing, but relatively few people got vaccinated afterwards, which means they don't have that buffer zone. You're going to have to learn that there's a bunch of things you need to do. What's ironic is so much of this stuff are stupid repeats of things we were doing back in the pandemic with the Spanish flu 100 years ago. And we should know better. But it shows that stupid people can be stupid even in the internet era.
Yeah, I think Dr. Dan mentioned this when we talked about the vaccine the first time. I don't know if I followed with him, but he said I even realized at the time that there was a mini pandemic during the Obama years with the bird flu or something like that. But since he actually cared, he actually followed protocol, it didn't spread.
It nipped it in the bud. Exactly. One of the Jackson and I, after we finished The Rocks Were There Too, and there's another book project, and then there's also one that we're going to do on conspiracy theories, working title, "They're All In On It!" ! The anti-vaxxer COVID mess is going to be one of the topics of that. So I'm keeping track of the stupid real time. And just today, just before this show, I was researching a bit that illustrated how bad method, the same bad method that yields creationism or Holocaust denial or fill in the blank stupid, is occurring in this anti-vax thing. Laura Ingraham on Fox News, Trumpista ideologue nutball, just tweeted a tweet where she linked to a almost 6 months or so old Federalist Society post that claimed that a CDC report argued that 70% of vaxxers weren't affected because 70% of the people that were infected had worn masks. Ironically, the paper was linked directly in the report. So you could look up the original paper. And it turns out they're misrepresenting the content of the paper, that it only looked at a tiny segment of a population, and the fact that almost all of them had had interactions with relatives when they wouldn't have been wearing masks. They were going to restaurants where it's difficult to eat while you have a mask on. And so there was a bunch of variables that they were cautioning about this study, and at a small sample. And even at the time, Snopes had called them out as bullshit, mostly false, for this statement. And by the way, similar things were being repeated by Donald Trump, who was still president at the time. I don't bet for a moment that Laura Ingraham thought 1 microsecond when she somehow scavenged this thing. How did she come by this? Did she have like a file cabinet where she kept a link to this from something from October of last year, that she lobs it now when it's not only a wrong post, but an obsolete wrong post, because it's July 2021, not October 2020. And so Ingram is showing exactly that same addiction to secondary sources that they don't fact check that is at the core of virtually any false belief. And so there's lessons to be learned from all of this, that bad method bites, and it can kill you, especially if the people who believe in that bad method end up as governors and presidents or media pundits that millions of people follow slavishly. How many people that watch Laura Ingraham on Fox Trump Pravda will ever bother to fact check anything she says when she doesn't fact check anything she says? What can you do?
Yeah. I went to the tweet. It was a comedy tweet, funny tweet about Fox News, and I said the last time I watched anything on Fox was Fox Kids in the 90s.
Yeah, and they've got it. We have to remember that, particularly the pundit division, not the news department per se, but the talking heads, the Tucker Carlsons and all of that. That's the creature of Rupert Murdoch, who is a hyper-conservative guy who wants to make tons of money exploiting fear and things for his own benefit. And it produces a coarsening and a fist-fighting nature to stuff. But even Fox Trump Pravda has angered some of the hyper-conservatives because it reported correctly that Biden won Arizona and things like that. That bothers them. So then they create new Newsmax and Oanon and others, and then fringe groups in that besides, that produces this tunnel vision bunker mentality where they're only listening to the people on the tiny little box that tells them the things they want to be true, and they never fact check any of it. Well, that's how flat earthers work.
So speaking of church and wrap this up. Speaking of church and state, is there church and state stuff in the rocks? Because they were there.
Unfortunately, tortucanosity as a mental problem is probably with us forever because it's part of the cognitive architecture, how human beings work. The issue is that I can think of several states that would be perfectly good to call them that. I think Nazi Germany was an example of that. I think Stalin Russia is an example of that. North Korea is certainly an example of that. The police state mentality in Castro's Cuba, the nutballs running Venezuela, the difficulties that was going on in Zimbabwe, and to the way we speak. And so this is a persistent difficulty that when people who have minds that can believe things that aren't true get in power, and if there's a big movement of people who believe that way and can shoot you if you disagree, it doesn't turn out well.
Yeah. We get Nazis and Hitler, both sides, one side's right, one side's wrong, obviously, but both sides, the one side, the craziest side is, Hitler was anti-religion, pro-Darwin, and all this stuff, and then the other side was no, he hated Darwin. I don't know if he was super religious or not, but he
was raised a Roman Catholic. He was not. He did a little bit of pretend practicing of it, partly for political purposes. So most of his examples of him going to church are before he became the Führer. After that point, no, his religion was going down to Berchtesgaden and petting the dog and looking at the mountains stuff, and going to rallies like Trump and hearing all the crowds, and let the minions do all the dirty work on it. His view of Christianity, he didn't like most Christianity because it was too weak. It believed in like kindness and helping the poor and all of that. That's wuss to him. No, he wants a masculinized, Aryanized Christianity. And there was actual efforts that the Nazis tried to do to create a proper Germanic Aryan style Christianity that was very aggressive and support. And they did an awful lot of efforts in that thing, and that got stopped because the regime disintegrated.
Yeah, and that's the other thing I mentioned earlier about the different split, the Protestants, the Catholic split, the theological split. Like in the early days, before the Catholic and the Orthodox split, there were the Arian Christianities, like the Vandals were.
Oh yeah, and it's different from the Arian bits with the Nazis. It's spelled differently. Arius was somebody who was regarded as a heretic. There was Arius, there was Marcion, there were a whole bunch. Anybody that wants to look into this, Bart Ehrman wrote a really neat book on lost Christianities that went into an awful lot of the various Christian groups that were operating before it all got turned into Catholicism and Orthodoxy much later on. And some of them just kind of withered away, and others were actively persecuted as heretics, and people got killed. In some cases, people moved way out into the countryside, into another country, and kept going out in the middle of nowhere because no one would bother them. They were pulling a Puritan trick, just go out to the wilderness and we'll do our thing on our own.
So coming up on your channel, you have the debate, and you have what's coming up on your Evolution Hour next week.
As usual, we're continuing our discussions, analyst source methods of replacing Darwin bit by bit. He's mired in his repeating a bunch of creationist tropes, so it's a different dynamic on there. And then bits that pop up on the creationism venue. I think I got some stuff scheduled next week for some stupid from the Discovery Institute that's been filtering off on things. Again, I don't know when the Titanic debate will occur, or if it does. James is disinclined to have a debate between just me and two Titanic nutballs. Somehow that doesn't seem fair or balanced from his point of view. But excuse me, I know the subject really well. I'm happy to do it all by myself.
Unfair to them or unfair to you? Is 1 on 2 unfair to them or unfair to you?
Oh, unfair to them. Yeah, I mean, that I can shred two stupids just as easily. This is an area, if I sound terribly overconfident, holy smokes, I know a lot about the Titanic. And I know the ins and outs of it, and is one of the, for those who don't know about the Titanic conspiracy theory, I'll just summarize it, that there's a bunch of varying ones out there that think that for a variety of possible motives, that somehow or other it was the damaged sister ship Olympic that was sunk, possibly for insurance, instead of the actual Titanic, and that the Titanic was then slipped in to continue as service under the Olympic name after the ship sinking.
Well,
this has one tiny problem, is that the two ships weren't identical. And I don't think any of these nitwits know that the two ships are not identical. And literally, you can look at the deck plan and pictures and details of the interior appointments and tell the two apart. It's not a secret, except apparently to them, because they're based on bad sources.
Oh, we went to this while you were fixing your computer and stuff. I mean, you're joking about this. And Alice and I started wondering the Titanic and stuff. And I was wondering, would there have been icebergs during the flood, the global Noah flood?
Oh, that's an interesting point, because for all practical purposes, the dogma in most young Earth creationism is that the Ice Age takes place after the flood. One Ice Age. So all that glaciation stuff is happening lickety-split afterwards. And so there really isn't much time. And remember, all the continents are shuffling around. To be fair, they're trying to have too much happen all at once. And you're never going to get a coherent picture from them putting all those pieces together, plus doing the math on how much heat's being generated. Because the more you have happen at once, all you have to do is to figure out what happens if you do this with your hands.
Yeah, I was thinking about
what
that.
happens
Like,
if you start doing this? They get hot.
yeah,
Exactly the same problem is happening.
I was thinking about that. If an iceberg could tear through the Titanic, a metal ship, I wonder how bad it would be with a wooden arc ship.
Oh, yes. In fact, here's another little fiddly bit that's been pointed out, that according to the one guy who calculated it, they've been very shy about figuring out how fast currents were during the flood. That according to the calculations of Baumgartner, that there would have been currents within about 50 days into the flood of 185 miles an hour. Now, admittedly, a current can carry you along without a problem, okay. But remember, there's all these land masses being moved around and stuff being dumped and gigantic floating islands. What exactly is the impact on the ark of slamming into a chunk of floating forest at 185 miles an hour, or 360 if they're coming in opposite directions, when we know what happened to a steel ship that scraped next to an iceberg at 22 knots? Let's do some calculations on that, shall we? And what's wrong with this picture?
Yeah,
that's going to be alluded to in the new book.
Yeah, as for me, I'm trying to get some. I'm trying to get some. I've from my future content. I'm trying to get lots of different topics in mind and head. I just got to get guests scheduled. I really want to have in the future a debunking episode of the COVID vaccine. You know, all the rumors about it. How it's this, it's that.
Yeah.
It's.
I'm sure Dan will help a lot because I think Dan's been studying a lot of that.
Yeah,
he's
very busy right now between fans.
And that one's very topical because it is a matter of people dying needlessly.
Yeah,
this is serious.
Yeah, I'm trying to get his schedule right now. Right, between his school teaching, his and his family, he's very little time right now.
Well, how dare he have a brand new baby, a family to contend with, and a teaching career? How selfish of Dan.
Yeah, another thing is. With Eric, I'm trying to do a deep dive on each of the primate branches. We talked about a few weeks ago. We talked about the hominids.
And people tend to overlook a lot of that stuff precisely because they want to know about our human end of it. But no, there's an amazing range of stuff. And Erica is exactly the person to be talking to on that because, boy, nobody's going to be more enthusiastic and knowledgeable on it.
Yeah, that's what I'm talking about her namesake, the gibbons, and other things, all the way from the tailless old world monkeys to the swinging new world monkeys. There's so many.
And there'd be an interesting issue about the biogeographical aspect, where they're originating, what speciation events and things are going on, how much of it's relating to changing diets and climate, and the fact that of the two newcomers on the block, us and orangutans are speciating at around the same time, 200,000-300,000 years ago.
Yeah, and so I mentioned the thing before that, like on our side of the pan homo brands, our side had a lot more fossils because we were out in Savannah Desert. There's less fossils of the pan split.
Oh, yeah. Chimpanzees are terrible because they live in a forest environment that just disintegrates the bones.
Yeah, and the other thing,
they have a terrible fossil record.
Another thing I'm going to do a deep dive on is each of the periods or epochs of the geological age. I had the one of the with Brainbug and Jackson about the Cambrian, but like with the dinosaur area, the Jurassic, the Cretaceous, the Ediacaran.
And there's so much neat about it because we know so much more now, so we can frame better questions and connect up stuff. Titanic was unsinkable, so it sank. The Ark was not unsinkable. Well, technically speaking, it was advertised as practically unsinkable, and people tended to forget the practical part. And to be fair, there had not been a major ship sinking in the European shipping industry since the 1870s. Ironically, it was another White Star ship, I think the New York or something, back in the 1870s, that had a big disaster. And then there had been another recent one a little bit after that, but nothing quite on that scale. And so from their point of view, they thought, what could go wrong? You're building of steel, you can see a long way, so you can see like icebergs coming. What could happen? Well, their experience had to do with ship collisions. And so what could be the worst possible argument? Okay, a ship slams in at the junction of two watertight compartments. So you flood two. You design the ship so it can have 4 flooded compartments and still stay afloat. Well, there you go. How can it be worse than that? That was the kind of logic that they went through. So from their point of view, the idea that their ship could scrape along the side of an iceberg for hundreds of feet along the ship, not actually making a gap. The total amount of gash in the Titanic is probably about the size of your bathroom rug. It's really small, but basically it's popping rivets out. And remember, the ship is huge, so that there's 20, 30, 40 feet below waterline. You have more water pressure down there than you do at the surface. Yeah. So tiny cracks, water is spewing in at fire hose pressure. That's what was sinking the Titanic.
Yeah, you would think. I was wondering about that. Why? I mean, up north, I guess, in the Baltic areas, I guess maybe they're used to, you know, like the Russian, Scandinavia. They might be used to going around icebergs and stuff because that's where they live. But I was wondering, why would you have a luxury cruise liner just go towards the swim?
Oh well, it's because of the dynamics of it that you want to take the shortest route across the Atlantic, and so just draw a line between Southampton. You go by the Grand Banks and all of that. Most of the time, it's not a problem because there aren't any icebergs in your way, in principle. Wintertime is not a problem. The icebergs aren't calving. It's in the spring when the icebergs start breaking off and drifting south. That's when you're getting icebergs. And they figured, you know, they can see them coming. It was an unnaturally calm sea. And also, they didn't have enough binoculars. One of the fateful lines that I have about the Titanic ship sinking is the noting that they had an inadequate number of binoculars available. Notice, pick up more binoculars when we get to New York.
Yeah. When was it did they always know, but when was it they knew that the icebergs were bigger in the bottom, they were on top above water?
Oh, that was known at that time.
Okay.
And in fact, ironically, Lightoller, who was the first officer, or first or second officer on the Titanic, had actually survived a shipwreck earlier in his career where he was stranded on an iceberg for quite a while. And you know what's something else fun fact about Lightoller is that he retired and eventually had his little private yacht that he had, his little sailing ship that he had. And in 1940 at Dunkirk, he was one of the people that were sailing out to pick up and rescue people from the Dunkirk battle. So there's a connection between Lightoller on the Titanic and the Battle of Dunkirk.
So how? One of those questions is how is the second book coming along? Is it you still in the middle of it? You still?
I'm slogging along on the giant Tales of the Big Slosh thing. I just finished up the segments on the Behemoth part. Now I'm moving on to Leviathan. After that section, then it's all on that cryptozoology crap about people who think that there are pictures of pterosaurs and dinosaurs in pictographs and the stegosaur in Cambodia and all of that crap is going to be that next section. Then there's going to be a detailed breakdown of why the creationist version of the Grand Canyon formation is just nonsense and the amount of information that they're leaving out.
Speaking of cryptozoology, over a long time I had this theory, you know, I don't know if it's more or not, that the Sasquatch and the Yeti were related through speciation. One side got stuck on the. Well,
there's an interesting lore about the whole issue of, and it's a legitimate question, is to what extent are some of these wild men, the Almases and Yetis and all that, some reflection of remnant populations of hominid cousins. And it's easier to think about this in Asia, because we know about the little hobbits. We know that Homo erectus and Homo sapiens overlapped, and we've got mysterious groups that they just discovered, the Denisovans and all the rest. So some of these wild men, hairy men legends may relate to that.
Yeah,
and one group, however, that I would love to have been the explanation for Sasquatch, because it would just be, unfortunately, it lacks facts. But if you look at the description of the gigantic Gigantopithecus bipedal ape from Asia that died out about 500,000 years ago, if there's anything that ever looks like a Sasquatch, that's it. But unfortunately, there's no indication that they ever went into the North America. It would be an apocalyptic discovery if it turned out that was the case. And any anthropologist would sell their grandmother to find evidence for it. But don't hold.
I know that we talked about, me and Erica talked about that in our migration, about how the none of the Neanderthals or the Homo erectus ever went up north to the land bridge. Wasn't until our Homo sapiens decided to go across.
The Neanderthal range didn't get that far east. They were in what we would now call Europe, and they also got into what we would call Bible area. Anatolia, Turkey, where Lebanon and Israel and stuff are. There were interaction zones between Neanderthals and human beings in that area, and that's where some of the interbreeding episodes were likely taking place.
Yeah, it was more the Devonistan brothers that went more east than they did, I think.
Yeah, and they have a range going all the way into the Caucasus area, but not all the way into Asia. And so they weren't really in a position to be able to go over that route. There may someday be. Well, another point is that it's not showing up in the haplotypes of data. When you look at the genomes, that they're able to infer an awful lot about who's migrating where and when. You're not seeing connections with sub-Saharan Africa, and you're not seeing connections with Australia, and you're not seeing connections with the Amerindian populations that are coming off of an Asiatic group that is human beings coming in, Homo sapiens, replacing that little blob. But you still have that interaction zone between three different groups. You have Neanderthals and the Denisovans, where we now started to actually have some better fossil data on them. Originally, they were just a genetic blip. And then there's still a third group that is hinted at in the genomes that we have no clue about them. There's no fossil record or anything to connect up with them, or even what kind of range they may have had. But there's a bunch of little question marks knocking around in there. The creationists will certainly misinterpret, but the scientists may be able to crack if they can get more data.
Yeah, I need to ask Erica about this next time I talk with her. I was before if there's any overlap with the Homo erectus and Neanderthal and the Homo sapiens at all, or the Homo erectus already died off time we got over there.
Yeah, it's highly likely there was a lot of overlap going on in there, and even in the case of the Homo heidelbergensis bunch that got around in Europe, and Homo neanderthalensis and Homo sapiens, there's all sorts of interesting opportunities for bunches bumping into each other.
Yeah,
and how all you needed was a small band of people with wanderlust.
Yeah,
somebody that was the equivalent of Joseph Smith and the Mormons heading into the wilderness.
I know
why wouldn't that have been going on in those times too?
Yeah, I don't know if it's true or not. That's Erica about this, but I think for the longest time, I think it was taught that the Heidelbergensis was the common ancestor between the sapiens, Neanderthals, and Devonians. They were
It's possible. Again, we don't have a huge amount of fossil data to go on. And some of the stuff are only known from teeth and jaws and partial skeletons and things like that. And when you get past the last 10, 20, 30, 40, 50,000 years, you're getting less and less ability to get DNA details out of any bones in that you uncover. You can theoretically, part of the way back, that's how they discern the Denisovans and the Neanderthal material. But farther back, we're talking 500,000 years ago, 600,000, 700,000 years ago, and that becomes much more difficult. No viruses will mutate other than its kind, just like the Bible says. Robert, you're a silly person.
Well, as we wrap this up, like I said, this guy gave me another idea for another series topic. I got maybe like a breakdown on all the Bill of Rights and on all the amendments. Like this is the first part of the First Amendment. Like that, That's
Yeah,
all.
and why they thought there was a need to do it to begin with. There was a great opposition. Once the Constitution was written, there were a lot who thought, well, we've done this, we've got it all done. And then there were a bunch of ones going, yeah, there's some little loopholes in here I think that we need to plug. And so the fight over the amendments was really quite significant in that early stage. Yeah, that's it's an area that I don't know nearly as much about. So you'll probably have to wrestle up somebody with greater field than that.
We can break down each of them, but I had papers, that like the last amendment that got ratified recently, and like in the 90s, or early 2000s, was actually, I think it was actually proposed during the original 1700s. I think that you can't get a pay raise until after you get a new office, get out of office, like that.
Yeah, and so and that's one of the great strengths. That once they created that Bill of Rights and the amendment process, that meant that you could correct stuff. And most of the time it's been benign in that things have been added on and refined. There's only been the one instance of where we added something on that we decided, no, we got to get rid of that. And that was the Prohibition Amendment.
But it's like
turned out to be a bad idea. Good intentions, but a bad idea.
Like voting things. Like first, we'll let black people vote. We'll let men vote. We'll let kids vote. We'll let 18-year-olds vote.
Yeah. Well, and remember too, prior to 1912, senators were not directly elected. That was another one of those amendments that they were appointed by their state legislatures. So the idea of electing a senator, it's got us Ted Cruz and Mitch McConnell and Paul Ryan. I mean, but nonetheless, it's us doing that, not a legislature doing
that. I remember, at least the right side, the same church that works both ways. They can't tell you how to worship or not worship, but you can't but the opposite way, you can't tell them how to run their government.
Yeah, and there's another matter of that. When, as a general principle, I would contend that when religions and government or ideologies in government get to be too tightly packed, it corrupts them all. It corrodes things. You get pompous. One of the things that's so sad about the Republican Party is the fact that it's imploded into a gerrymandered monstrosity that's increasingly out of touch with its own constituents. That many of the positions being taken by the leadership and the people that are in office under that Republican name aren't paying attention to what even their own people think, although they are able to maneuver themselves into being reelected because they've skewed the districts in such a way that it's almost impossible to get them out. And that means that they're becoming increasingly disconnected from their electorates, and that's not good for the country, as well for their party.
Well, as I always say, never stop learning and enjoy the randomness. We'll see you next time, and we'll see you all on Revolution Hour Wednesday. Bye.
Yep. Stay safe, everybody.